especially when we're talking to people who are working in the field to understand where we've all come from and how we might be able to relate to each other. I do want to share a little bit about the current research and projects that I'm involved and engaged with in case it's something that sparks your own interest for something that you might want to replicate or something that you're interested in just learning more about more generally. And then we are going to talk about disability in the Arab world, something that I've been immersed in for the last, it sounds absolutely mad for me to say it, but the last 10 years I've been immersed in this, and I'm hoping that I can share some things with you that you might find useful, as Di said, in your own practice, but also just generally as a point of interest. And then just a few of my own lessons learned. I was reflecting on this idea of leadership for inclusive education. And so some of the things that I reflect on when I speak to leaders or when I think of occasionally myself as a leader in the field, some things that I'm hoping that we can change and move forward in the field with. And then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. I do have two screens, so I am attempting to make sure that I have the chat up as well as my PowerPoint slides. So please do feel free to drop things in the chat and I will try and attend to them as we go. But equally, if you want to just write them down, keep some notes next to you, I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So without further ado, where have I been and why am I here? Both why am I here with you all today, but also why am I here in Dubai? Not just because it's warm and sunny. We actually have a clear day outside today. Finally, the weather is turning for the better and not the hot, humid, and sandy. So I guess to just give a little bit of background about myself. I've always worked in non-traditional settings. My first job out of college as a fresh teacher graduate was actually in a residential facility for boys with behavioral, social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And I worked there for 2 years before I moved to Jordan, and you can see a picture of me with my Bedouin family there. I moved to Jordan where I worked out in the northeast desert, which is called the Badia. I worked in a small Bedouin community there, and I was in a school that was serving students with a variety of different disabilities and needs from the entire government. So Jordan is divided up into 11 different governance, and I was in the Northeast, which is the Mafraq government. And it kind of, for those of you who are familiar with the area, I always say it's like the arm of Jordan. And I was out on the road to Baghdad. And I spent 2 years there living in a small village with about 1,000 people in it. While I was there, I learned to speak Arabic. I lived with the family and I taught at the small school that was serving the entire region. So we had students who were deaf, we had students who had intellectual impairments, developmental delays, students who didn't have diagnoses, and we also ran the charity works out of the school. That was part of a Peace Corps program, an American program that sends young people around the world to countries who have invited us in to support different areas of need in their countries. And in Jordan, they had asked for English teachers and special education teachers, which is how I found myself there. After my time in Jordan, I returned to the States where I studied for my master's degree and taught in the American public school system. Again, though, I was teaching in what would be considered in many ways a non-traditional setting. I continued to work with students who had emotional and behavioral challenges in what I consider now an exclusionary school, or in more kind of normative terms, a self-contained setting for students, and that was at the middle school level. I was teaching English and social studies until I realized I hated teaching English because a lot of my students hated reading. So I switched with a co-teacher and I began teaching science and social studies. And after that, I decided to hit the road again and I found myself in Norway, where I did a little bit of teaching American history as well as working on teacher development, traveling the country from Stavanger to Svalbard. And from there, I moved to Belgium and I spent a few years on the international school circuit, working in inclusion programs in a very different space. I found myself having moved from the United States, where I was working with students who were primarily from lower socioeconomic statuses, who had single family household, or sorry, single parent households. Many were gang involved. And then when I moved on the international schools, I was working with very high socioeconomic status students, coming from homes where they're two-parent homes, and many of them were involved as CEOs or ambassadors. And so it's a very different set of students, but all of them still working around learning disabilities and behavioral challenges. From there, I went off back. I kind of have a back and forth relationship with my country. I tend to go back to get a degree and then leave again. So I went back to the US, where I got my PhD in special education from the University of Virginia. I chose, however, to do my dissertation in comparative policy work, and my advisor very wisely said to me, just pick a country and stick to it. Don't try and compare a bunch of them because you'll never finish. So I went back to Jordan, a place that I consider kind of my soul's home. And I worked on a comparative case study there, looking at the international influence of international policy decisions and the international aid movement within the Jordanian government to understand how it was influencing inclusive policies within the country. And then I also worked at the school level and tried to understand how Jordanian teachers were conceptualizing inclusion in the public school system. And from there, I found myself opening up the University of Birmingham's Dubai campus, where I lead on our Masters of Inclusion and Special Educational Needs here. And we also have a postgraduate certificate. The campus has been open since 2017. I joined in 2019 when my programs started. We have students from all over the world who join us, and we run both teacher training programs here. So we run the IQTS program, the International Qualified Teacher Status program from the Department for Education in the UK. We also run 3 different master's programs in educational leadership, inclusion and special needs, and teaching and learning. So we run a variety of programs here in Dubai from our campus, pulling on students who have joined us from around the world and who are living here in the UAE. So it's a little bit about my background, and you can see that I definitely kind of come from this non-traditional setting, and I tend to try and buck the system whenever possible. And I think that's something that many of us who work with inclusion have in common, because I think often we've identified that school systems are not working for many of our students, regardless of what sort of disabilities they might or might not have. Traditional schooling is maybe not the end all be all. And I'll leave that there, and we'll come back to that as we continue through my presentation. A little bit about what I'm working on right now. You can kind of see from my current research and projects that I continue on this non-traditional vein. While I do education is the core of what I do, I like to find different ways into education and different ways of thinking about education. So one of my main pieces of work over the past 2 years has been an art advocacy project in Jordan, where I have been working with the National Gallery of Art, and we have developed a series of exhibitions. It started with a photography exhibition with photographs taken by a small group of students with disabilities sharing what was important in their lives. And it has grown and blossomed, and in just under a week, I will be headed to Jordan for the first annual Disability in the Arts Summit, where we're bringing together artists, disabled artists and non-disabled artists, gallery owners, architects, to come together and talk about how we can create a more inclusive art scene in Jordan. And for those of you who don't know, Jordan actually has a really vibrant art scene. And so we are eager to make it a more inclusive one for artists with disabilities. I've just wrapped up a grant working in Ras Al Khaimah, which is another emirate within the UAE. This was looking at a rural emirate where there are very few private schools and they are much more reliant on the public school system, and trying to understand what do teachers know and understand about autism and how prepared are they to teach students with autism in their schools. And I have been, over the past year, working with the Ministry of Education to better understand what are the provisions and policies of inclusive education in the United Arab Emirates. We have been looking at both public and private schools from K through 12, all the way through higher education and vocational training institutions here in the UAE. It has been a fascinating project, both from trying to understand the way that the government works here, but also this really complicated system of education that we have in the UAE, which operates on a federal system where we have a federal government, but then we also have these 7 emirate governments: Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Fujairah, Ajman, it's going to test me, Ras Al Khaimah, Al Quwain. And all of those different emirates have their own sort of smaller governments and education authorities who are shepherding in the private education. So it's been a really fascinating project. And I think what I'm most proud of is the efforts that these grants have done to support teachers, to support on the ground work by the people who are in these regions. I'm really proud of the art advocacy in my efforts in starting it, but what's most important to me is that it's been taken on by the National Gallery, and I call them my co-conspirators, but my co-creators in Jordan. It has taken on a life of its own with them, and it will continue and become sustainable. In addition to that, the work that we've done in Ras Al Khaimah with our teachers out there has led to over 300 teachers engaging in training and support to better understand how to become more inclusive teachers in their classrooms. And as we look at the changes and the recommendations that are coming out as a result of the Ministry of Education grant, we do hope to see them update their inclusive and special educational policies in the coming years. So it's been a really exciting and vibrant time here. I think it's when I think about the advice that my advisor gave me so many years ago, choose a country and stick with it. Choosing somewhere in the Middle East was a really smart move. This is an area that is seeing exponential growth and change, and the education system here is growing rapidly. And as a result of that, we are also seeing a lot of movement and change and development around disabilities, disability rights, and inclusion in not just schools, but in workplaces and general communities and societies. I'll pause there. I don't see any questions coming through, but I'm always mindful that I will just talk and talk and talk because I get excited about these things. But I'll just open it up if anybody has any immediate questions that they want to ask about background, or any questions about the UAE or Dubai. And no question is too small or too out there. I know that when as an American, we don't think of the UAE very often. I know that I've actually met a lot of Welsh people who have moved to the UAE, and there's certainly a large population of expatriate Brits who are here. And so I'm always mindful that this is more of a vacation spot for many people, and they don't realize that there's actual work that goes on here too. But I'm happy to just pause if anybody had any questions. So you can put them in the chat if you don't want to unmute. I understand that. And I'm also happy for you to unmute and have a chat with me as well. Give a little bit more of a pause. Okay. All right. I didn't see anything come through, but if it does, please feel free to, Di, just let me know and I'll pause and go back to the chat. So what I do want to do is just kind of center ourselves in the region. Um, I have been working here, like I said, since the first time I came was in 2004. And then I came back again in 2016 and have been and came back and forth until 2019 when I permanently moved to the permanently as anybody ever moves to the UAE. I moved here in 2019. And so a little bit of modern history or look at the region. All of the countries here have participated in the major disability rights initiatives over the past 20 years. So we see them as signatories and as people who have signed on and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities. In addition to that, the majority of the countries in the region have also signed on to what's called the Covenant of the Rights of the Child in Islam, and that came out in 2005 and does address both education and disability within it. One of the other sort of modern pushes or drivers of the changes within the region are the amount of regional conflicts and the amount of disability that is created as a result of war and ongoing conflict here. In addition to that, however, the involvement of the UN brings in those global norms around inclusion and disability. And they bring those in a variety of different ways. And so we see the UN within governments like Jordan's government, Syria, or Lebanon's government. The UN's involvement there is, helping to shape and craft policy in these countries around education, disability, and inclusion. And certainly when you read the policies or the translations of the policies, you can see language, global language around inclusion being mirrored in those policies. And that's really the involvement of the UN in supporting those governments. But in addition to that, especially around Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, you can see that the involvement of the UN in schooling, the UNRWA schools, means that teachers have been exposed to the UN conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities and adhering to a UN understanding of inclusion and what it means to create inclusive schools. Because Palestinian children, as well as other displaced children throughout the region, are going to schools that are run by the UN, you have UN-trained teachers. They are being influenced by the international protocols around disability and inclusion. And so within the areas of conflict, generally within the Levant region, you can see the influence of those international bodies, not just the UN, but the World Bank. American government is one of the biggest donors to Jordan. The EU also massive donor to Jordan and other governments within the region. We see GIZ, the German International Cooperation Organization. Their largest project over the last few years was in inclusive education to develop the sector within Jordan. So we see a lot of international influence within the governments and the policies and the teacher training programs. Which provides that rapid growth in the education sector, not just within the Levant region, but then we also widen our lens to the rest of the Arab world. And we look at places like the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and we're looking at countries whose educational system really only just got started in the 1950s or the 1970s. They're really not old. When we talk about education in the UAE, many of our Emirati students, their grandmothers or great-grandmothers are illiterate or have never attended school because there weren't schools in the country. They were Bedouins. And so I think it's really important to think about how long the education sector has been in existence in Wales or in England, or in my case, in the United States, and then think about how long it's been in existence here and realize how rapidly education is expanding, growing, and changing in a region that is rapidly growing, changing, and expanding. We see a massive push to emiratize the teaching population here. Qatar just recently has undergone its own sort of making sure that they had enough Qatari teachers. Saudi Arabia is in the process of training hundreds of thousands of teachers for their burgeoning educational market. So we really see this rapid growth of the education sector, both in the Levant region, but also here in the Gulf region, where it's being driven by money and finances as well. So I think in addition to looking at the kind of where the countries currently are, it's also really important to think about where we have come from. And that is, you know, part of what I teach in my coursework is I work with my students on kind of understanding how disability has been constructed in a certain place at a certain time, to understand how we've gotten to where we currently are. And disability history in the Middle East takes a slightly different turn. And in some ways, we see similar reasons for disability that you would have seen across the world. But in addition to that, we do see cousin marriages being one of the highest in the world. And that's as a result of the strong cultural ties of marrying within your tribe, marrying within your family, keeping the family's honor, but also money and goods, and keeping the family name. And so that contributes to a higher number of developmental disabilities or intellectual impairments within the region. But other than that, and then of course, as we talked about, in modern day, we see a lot of the war and conflict influencing the reasons for disability here. But historically, similar reasons in addition, and then we add the marriages. One piece that I found absolutely fascinating as I was reading about the history in the Middle East is there's an iodine deficiency in the soil here, which has contributed to disability, and in particular sensory disabilities here, and looking at vision impairment and hearing impairments that might have been impacted historically back in the Ottoman Empire because of a lack of iodine in the soil, which I just found a fascinating regional little bit of information about why or the causes for disability here. One thing that I really like to talk about with people when thinking about disability history in the Middle East, often when people find out that I work here, they're like, oh, those poor people with disabilities there, it's a shame. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about culture and Islam, and understanding that, this region of the world is a primarily Islamic region, and people are, the majority are practicing Muslims. Islam looks different wherever you go in the world. Islam here is very, from the UAE to Jordan, the people are practicing Islam in different ways. In my village in Mafraq, where I was living in Jordan, to Amman, Islam looks different. If you move from here to Indonesia, Islam looks different. And so I think it's really always very important to try and remember to separate Islam and culture. Obviously, they're interwoven and they influence each other. However, when we're talking about disability, it's important to understand that what Islam says about disability is actually very little. There's very little in the Quran about disabilities specifically, but it's the culture that is shaping our viewpoints and our understanding about disability. Most of the information that we're able to glean about disability in the ancient Arab Ottoman kind of world is through medical texts. through travelers' journals, people who were traveling through the region, be they merchants or doctors, and their journals in which they describe the disabled individuals that they ran across. The medical field was burgeoning within the Ottoman Empire. And so we learn a lot from the medical texts about how they were treating disability and disabled individuals. We also read a lot in the laws, which is really kind of a fascinating piece because you read the laws about marriage and divorce, and there will be pieces in there about whether men or women who are disabled can marry, whether they can consent. And so what we learn about disability in the ancient Arab and Ottoman world is really based in medical text, travel journals, and the laws of the land at the time. Commonly written about and discussed are deafness, muteness, blindness, intellectual disabilities, also frequently referred to as impairments of the mind, and interestingly, intersex individuals. And I think that this is an important one to highlight because when we talk about how disability is constructed within a certain culture, we understand that because of the importance of marriage, family, and childbirth, that actually intersex individuals occupied a very particular space and needed to have laws to understand how marriage, childbirth, and the gendered lifestyle of the region at the time was going to impact them. And so there's actually a surprising amount written about intersex individuals within the history of the Ottoman Empire because of the importance of those gendered roles in the family. I think the other piece that it's really important to understand, and Sarah Scalinga, who wrote the most comprehensive history that I've seen about disability in the Middle East, really highlights the fact that many disabled individuals continue to be included as leaders, often in the religious faith. Islam is a Quranic scholars recite and recite the Quran, and so being able to read wasn't necessary. They could memorize and recite. The muezzins, the people who do the call to prayer, they could be blind scholars, and that was accepted and became a position that disabled individuals were able to occupy within the society. And so I think, again, we come back to that idea of we need to make sure that we are contextualizing and understanding how certain countries, cultures, and time periods are constructing an idea about what is disability. And often what we see in the Middle East is that actually those with disabilities were being included in their communities in different ways. As religious men, scholars, those with sensory impairments are often recorded as the pages or confidants of the rulers, the messengers. They often, deaf or mute people would be the pages or the messengers who would go back and forth because the reasoning that scholars have come up with is because they spoke very individualized versions of sign language that only the rest of the community could understand, and therefore the messages could never be stolen, or they could only be passed to the person that they were supposed to be passed to. So just interesting ways that people with disabilities were being included in their communities and as a part of the daily life, rather than necessarily, I think many people in today's world would think, oh, they were stigmatized, they were put on the outside, they were excluded, but actually very differently than the Christian world. It wasn't tied to sin. There is no sort of association of sin and disability as we might find in other places. And in fact, when we look at the Quran, disability is a part of the 5 pillars of providing charity and supporting the community members who have less. And that is one of the pillars of Islam. And so it's not actually, in many ways, it's a very different conception of disability than we might see in other religious practices. So just a little bit about the history and kind of where we've come from and how those with disabilities were included in the society and in their communities here at the beginning of this region, or close to the beginning anyways. And then kind of moving us into what it looks like here and now. So since I first arrived in the region in 2004, it has been just a tremendous sort of change from 2004 to 2016 when I came back. The increasing visibility over that 10 years was dramatic, to say the least. I went from working in the only school in the Badia for students with disabilities and never seeing my students who would be picked up from the bus, brought to our school, and then dropped back off, and they wouldn't go anywhere else. Often, occupying a room in their house, and they wouldn't go out to the weddings and the parties and things like that. To when I go to Amman now, I see students with disabilities working in grocery stores. I see them out with their families. There are many schools all around. We see the development of special education programs at the University of Jordan and across universities throughout Jordan. When we think about Emirati culture and the UAE, when you talk to people who have been here for 10 to 20 years, this idea of inclusion and including people with disabilities in our day-to-day communities, we again kind of see that rapid growth and expansion and acceptance of disability coming online to the point where we now have almost a fully functioning inclusive school system here. And we're looking at how do we now bring that to the universities, colleges, and workplaces. And so this rapid growth and transformation over the past 10 and 20 years. One of the challenges to this sort of increasing visibility and rapid expansion of the understanding of inclusion and making sure that people with disabilities are included in their communities is infrastructure. Infrastructure in much of the Levant region is largely inaccessible. The buildings are old, the curbs are high. We just don't have the money in those places and in those countries to retrofit buildings necessarily, or to upkeep buildings to make sure that there is physical accessibility. It's certainly physical accessibility is better in the Gulf. In fact, I was just seeing the other day that the UAE has been named one of the most accessible travel destinations for people with disabilities. And so certainly within the Gulf, we see, what would be fairly standard or typical in an airport. I'm sure in Wales, and I know when I travel back to Birmingham, seeing the sunflower lanyards and having sensory rooms or quiet places for people who are being overstimulated or dysregulated in the airport. That's actually, we have those here in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, and one of our school partners, Al Karama, has worked closely with the airports here to ensure that the airports are accessible. So while infrastructure remains largely inaccessible in the Levant region, just due honestly to monetary reasons, in the Gulf, we do see many of the modern institutions and buildings becoming more and more accessible. Within Dubai and the UAE, we do see a fairly unregulated professional capacity. There's a limited amount of holistic policies to govern the care of individuals with disabilities when it comes to medical professionals, as well as educational and therapies. These are still these are policies that are in the works and often unregulated at the moment. There's also limited professional development in Arabic, and this is, I can speak Arabic, but I'm not fluent. So even I have to bring in, when I want to do professional development for Arabic speaking teachers, I have to bring in colleagues and friends to do that. And so it is a challenge to create materials for professional development for people whose first language is Arabic and people who only speak Arabic, because there's just a lack of publications, there's a lack of professional development and professionals. And then in addition to all of that, which adds to it, is this lack of regulation, because the government here sits in very siloed, the laws and policies as well as the enforcement of those laws and policies is very siloed. And so we don't see the Ministry of Education working well with the Ministry of Health to make sure that schools are able to access regulated and evaluated sort of professionals in order to support students with different therapies. There is some shame and stigma still associated with intellectual disabilities. What's really fascinating here is the growth in the use of the autism label, which has largely been demystified for a lot of people, and where an intellectual disability like Down syndrome or a developmental disability like Down syndrome might still be associated with parental shame, with blame for the mother or the family. Autism has been largely demystified and very clearly put as a medical diagnosis. And so there's less shame and stigma with an autism label than with other disability labels. So we actually see a lot of students receiving a diagnosis of autism where they might not have that same label put on them in other places in the world, but it allows the parents and the families to access more supports and access more community acceptance, which has been a really fascinating thing for me to watch and study as I've been here. Just a few other pieces. I feel like I've talked a lot, and I know I still have a few more things. So I don't want to bore you guys too much with all of this. And those are just some of these idea around culture constructing our idea of disability, and within the Arab region generally, there's these deeply rooted ideas of pride and honor, particularly within your family unit. And those feelings of pride and honor and how we gain it and how we lose it can be very significantly tied to disability and to schooling, which influences how inclusive education has developed here. When a child has a disability, there can be seen as a shame on the family. It can cause problems for people in marriages. Often, they're still operating on very traditional gendered roles, where the mother carries that honor and that pride. And if she gives birth to a disabled child, there can be familial consequences for that. They can carry more feelings of shame because they've dishonored their family. But I think that we also need to look at the reverse of that. And when we see students with disabilities entering schools, graduating from schools and getting jobs, we see them bringing pride and honor back to the families. And so one of my pieces of work with a lot of people has been to really focus on how can we use these ideas of pride and honor to actually encourage inclusive schooling opportunities so that we can see students with disabilities actually bringing pride and honor to their families, much like their brothers and sisters do when they graduate with the Tawjihi scores. As I said earlier, just like we have to separate Islam from Arab culture, we also need to remember that there's large rural and urban divides across this region. The socioeconomic status divides and wealth gaps are incredibly large, and these sort of both rural, urban, and socioeconomic statuses can greatly influence outcomes for children with disabilities, as well as inclusive schooling opportunities. Um, because public schools in the region have been suffering due to a lack of funding and both infrastructure and teacher training, many things that are plaguing school systems the world over, but overcrowding and financial issues within many of these countries mean that the public school systems are failing all of their students. And so those parents and families who have the economic means to are enrolling their students in private education across the region. We're seeing a massive growth and expansion of private education. Which often comes with more inclusive education as well, but that's only available to the families who can afford it. And then my most recent work has been actually with children who are in inclusive schools, and it's allowed us to really better understand what are the attitudes of children towards disability, which are really reflected in their parental attitudes as well. My latest two pieces of research work have both been with parents and then with also the children. And one of the things that we see come out, well, there might be less shame and stigma or negative attitudes. We still see that charity model of disability being perpetuated within the region. And when people the way people understand disability here is through a lens of we must take care of them. There is pity, and there is the need to care for without actually seeing the individual's abilities to be independent, to be contributing members of the family, and they're really not necessarily seen as a burden because, and I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, but we do really kind of the go-to response to disability here is a model of charity and care rather than support and rights-based. And so I just want to kind of again flip, just like I was trying to flip that idea of pride and honor. This comes from a keynote that I gave a year ago now in Jordan at their inclusive education conference that was sponsored by GIZ. And in it, I really focused with the participants on this idea of what does the Jordanian or what does the Arab cultures have that can be capitalized on to create a more inclusive education setting. And these are some of the ideas that are coming out of disability studies in Europe, North America, and this idea of interdependence. And I think that's one of the strengths of the region, and it's one of the reasons that I love living here and I keep coming back here is the sense of community is strong. I left in 2006 and I came back in 2014, and the family that I lived with welcomed me back with open arms. We're still in touch today. We celebrate births and deaths and marriages together. And you know, you can't show up in the region without somebody inviting you in for a cup of tea. And this is truly a strength of the region, this interdependent relationship that people have with each other, with their neighbors and with their families and with their large and extended families. And this is also a point that the disabled community in many of the communities that we've grown up in are championing, this idea that we cannot really ever have full independence, and that we actually need to be studying interdependence. And that might be a better model for both our education, but also as we think about disability, that we are all interdependent. And so I think that this is something that we really have to learn from this region of the world, is this idea of interdependence. And you can see there, if you don't follow her yet, you should, Nina Tame. She did give me permission to use this picture for the talk, but I think generally if you don't follow her, please do. So just some closing thoughts before I turn it over to you all for questions. I'm sorry, I've just talked at you. I have been glancing at the chat and I haven't seen anything come through. So I'm assuming you're all holding on to your questions. Just a few of my own lessons that I've learned and things that I I talk with my students about things that are still circling in my head, things that square with my thinking, and points that stick out. And so just a few things from me over the last 10 years in this region. Um, Really, this globalized understanding and definition of what good education looks like, it troubles me. I think the influence of private and for-profit schooling that we're seeing in the region, because it's pushing foreign curriculums into the region and losing the local education that could benefit people here within the UAE, within Jordan, within Syria or Iraq. We're really There is both a divide, as we were just talking about, for the socioeconomic status, but also a cultural status. Largely the private schooling is occurring in English, and we're losing local languages. Many of my teachers that I work with who teach Arabic and Islamic are struggling with their Arab students wanting or bothering to learn Arabic because they just don't see the purpose in it. And that troubles me. It's something that I think that the world should be paying attention to much more, that actually our schooling should be more grounded in our communities and the national needs rather than a global understanding of what good education is. And I think that's being pushed for many reasons, for profit, for testing scores, for political gain. But within this region in particular, there is a desire to be in a British curriculum school or an American curriculum school. And what that means as a point of pride and a price point is troubling because it doesn't necessarily serve the needs of the community around it. In addition to that is this dominant influence of the North American, European, UK models of understanding of disability. I think it's quite striking that when you read through policies throughout the region, they reference the medical model and the social model without necessarily have a grounding in why and how those models are being used and how they are being debated and maybe moving forward and changing in the countries where they originated. And possibly, as I was just talking about interdependency, we actually need to have more community-based models or better understand what the models of disability are within the countries that we're working with and not continuing to import these views of disability that don't always match up. There's a wonderful article, I'd recommend all of you read it, by Goodley, came out in 2018, and just this idea of when we think about disability, we're often conceptualizing disability and policing disability language based on how we talk about it in Europe, the US, and the UK, and we actually, the larger population, global population, is in the global south, in the non-weird countries, whatever terminology you want to use. But the language that's used to describe and talk about disability, and how we understand the intersections of disability and war, or disability and poverty, that, and not always basing it on what's happening in more economically developed countries. And then, kind of as I was reflecting on how all of this might have something to do with you all, and trying to tie something that might seem very foreign to home, I'm always struck by this idea that relying on the community around us and their lived experience and insider knowledge, and how much that should be influencing us and our practices as leaders and as teachers. My class this week with my students was about listening to the disabled voices. And so we read we did a lot of readings from the student perspective about how students with disabilities felt about their labels and their badges, and how they conceived of their disabilities within school. And it was how many of my students who work with students with disabilities every day have never actually specifically discussed disability with the children that they're working with. And so really listening to those who have lived experience of disability, but also I think in our increasingly global communities, making sure that we're asking parents and family members what's important to them. One of my colleagues and I do a lot of work around cultural construction of disability and what disability means to different people. And we think often about autism and how many of the typical markers for autism are based in social practices developed in Europe and North America, and actually have very little bearing on what might be important for somebody in an Asian country or somebody in an Arab country, and how the markers for autism might actually be very different in these places, and we're not paying attention to that. And so as you are working with people who are coming into your communities as refugees and immigrants, to make sure to be led by them and to listen to their lived experience to help craft your practice. So hopefully that's what you were looking for, Di. I still always have a little bit of imposter syndrome when somebody asks me to do a expert talk like this, but hopefully it has provoked some thinking, and I'd love to just spend the last 20 minutes in a dialogue with folks.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that was fascinating in terms of what you shared, not just in terms of your own individual journey, as Rhiannon has mentioned in the chat, really fascinating in terms of your own journey through education, but also in terms of educational practices and perspectives in this particular part of the world as well. We do have one question in the chat at the moment from Abby, and I think this refers to your kind of starting point in education, working with children with kind of emotional behavioural challenges potentially. So do you have any effective classroom or well-being strategies that you could share in relation to pupils who may be experiencing trauma?
Yeah, so Abby, thanks for the question. And I think that that has two parts to it, right? One is my experience working with students in mainstream school settings in the United States who might have experienced trauma versus working with both adult and children in the Middle East who are experiencing trauma. And those are two very different types of trauma. No, that's fine. I was guessing that you were probably going with the war trauma. But I do think that it is important for everybody to recognize that there's trauma is a big word, and there's actually a very large, not large, there is pushback from the Palestinian communities about treating their children as having post-traumatic stress disorder when actually it's ongoing traumatic stress disorder. And because I have not actually been in the classroom teaching, I've never been a direct teacher in the Middle East because my Arabic skills are just not good enough. I generally work with the teachers. I don't have any, I would be hesitant to give you any sort of trauma around refugees and them. What I will say is we approach it from creating a safe space and relationships as you would in any classroom. That sort of good practice is good practice, and allowing education to take a back seat to you being a safe and a safe place for students to come, a safe place for students to share, but also to be able to work on something that is not necessarily tied to war and trauma, giving hope for the next day. This is, again, where I come back to schools really need to be focused in working in their communities and what does their community need. And students within this region of the world are going to have to not only heal themselves, but heal their communities and develop ways for their communities to move forward and replant the seeds of their culture and their society. And so I think providing that help and support in doing that is the best place to come from.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Abby, for your question. I think there's a lot for us to think about in terms of Wales as being a country of sanctuary at the moment, for example, and thinking about some of the different parts of Wales, like Wrexham and Swansea, being cities of sanctuary in terms of supporting students who may be joining us who've experienced those challenges. So we have a question next from Michael. So Michael, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hello, Sarah. Sorry about